Welcome to Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower, a videocast series on arms control, non-proliferation, and related international security issues. I'm Sarah Bidgood, Director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California.
And I'm Hanna, Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation.
Join us as we discuss cutting-edge research and what it means for real-world decision-makers. Whether it's nuclear doctrine, deterrence dynamics, regional challenges, or the state of international regimes, there's just so much to talk about.
And with our guests, we'll break down how their analysis can help us make sense of a complex security landscape.
In each episode, we'll bring Machiavelli into the Ivory Tower.
Thanks for watching. We're glad you're along for the ride.
Welcome to Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower. Our guest today is Dr. Mariana Budjeryn, who is a research associate with the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Mariana, thank you so much for making the time to join me and Hanna today. We are thrilled to have you with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's jump right in. You have a new book out. It is called Inheriting the Bomb: The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine. I'm sure it is more timely than you possibly could have imagined when you were writing the book. I'm wondering if you can kick us off by telling us a little bit about, the story that you tell in the book, some of your major findings, maybe what motivated you to write the book, and who should read it.
So the book is the product of, more than 10 years of my research and writing. It is based on my PhD dissertation that I started writing back in, or conceived and researched since 2010. So it's been more than 10 years. It is quite heavily adapted. So it's quite a departure from what the original dissertation had been. Simply because as I was writing this book, I saw that more space should be dedicated to actually the empirical part of the story, as I was finding more and more gaps, as it were, in the story of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament. And as you mentioned, as the time progressed, it became more and more pertinent, given the developments in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. So the title of the book is and subtitle are self-explanatory. It is essentially a story of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, but I was also attempting to give a glimpse of the whole process of Soviet dissolution through this lens, through the lens of Soviet nuclear armaments and debates over the fate of Soviet nuclear arsenal after its collapse. And specifically, something that hasn't received as much attention is debates over succession rights, right? So what we had essentially was this really unprecedented occurrence where one of the major nuclear powers and a recognized nuclear weapons state under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, had disintegrated. And the questions of who should succeeded and how the kind of the status of nuclear arms outside of Russia would be treated was also uncharted international political and international legal territory. And I think one of the things that perhaps this book would be helpful with is sort of upstaging this constant conflation that I see as a Ukrainian and as a scholar, this constant conflation between the Soviet Union, the USSR, and Russia, right? That has happened back in the Soviet days. We casually, or even, some of the very, very bright and very well-informed people would refer to the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, right, unproblematically. And now we say, Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. But that transition was not so seamless. It had to happen. There had to be a policy that was formulated and a policy that was implemented. So Russia is not just sort of the Soviet Union, just a little bit truncated, and then the earth opened up, and out of it came the Belarusians and the Kazakhs and Ukrainians. those were the people and the institutions in the republics that were there all along. And even though they were invisible for the West through much of the Soviet period, they came to matter in late 80s and in the early 90s when these countries became independent. So I'm hoping to kind of shed light on that process through the book. And another contribution I'm hoping to make is to tell the story based on Ukrainian sources, but also sources from Belarus and Kazakhstan. And even though the story from Belarus and Kazakhstan became sort of secondary in my book, my dissertation was more evenly balanced between those three cases. In the book, I decided to focus more squarely on Ukraine. But I endeavored to really tell the story from the perspective of those countries using the interview data and archival materials from those states. We do have some very, very good accounts of the post-Soviet nuclear disarmament story, but most of them are based on Western sources. So this is, no book can aim to be sort of the comprehensive story of a certain occurrence, but I'm hoping that my book would contribute sort of the non-Western part of the story to the general historical record of that unprecedented set of events.
That's great, Mariana. I actually want to pick up on sort of this last point that you made, which relates to your sourcing. At our work at CNS and in Hanna's and my work in particular, we often do sort of comparative historical case study analysis. So I'm always very curious about how people kind of go about getting the story that they end up telling in their research. So could you tell us a little bit more about the sources that you ended up using? You mentioned wanting to tell this from the perspective of Ukraine. How did you go about doing that?
So to begin with, my dissertation, when it was conceived, was more of a political science, of an IR type of work, where I looked at the workings of the international non-proliferation norm that kind of reverberated differently in the three settings, in Ukraine and Belarus and in Kazakhstan. So Ukraine needed a lot more cajoling, right? It wasn't, it took a longer and more convoluted path towards the NPT. And even though sort of the outcome in all three cases was the same, I was interested in the process. I thought, well, why some countries adopt, the non-proliferation norm and join the NPT kind of easily like that, and then, others do not. And I was hoping, just to do this comparative case study and mostly draw maybe on secondary sources and supplement a little bit with original research, as sort of just to have these case studies. And as I was starting to put this together, I realized, exactly that there are accounts, but most of them are from that period, from early 90s, right? So when this was fresh, this was still interesting. There were a few really good, really high quality monographs or chapters that were written about this. And then it sort of, the topic disappeared and it became either less relevant or just, scholars did not devote much attention to it. And as I was trying to reconstruct the case studies, reconstruct these stories, I saw that the existing accounts were mostly based on Western sources. Some had interview data from the people who were making decisions at the time. So the president and, Bill Potter at Monterey wrote a very good monograph, I think in 1986. And he went out and he talked to the people. But I thought, surely, there must be more to this. There's these archival materials. And I wasn't trained as a historian. This was my I did this by trial and error through the archives, but I just basically went to Ukraine and installed myself there for some time and started going to the archives and digging in at the Central Archive of state institutions in Kiev and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive. I was able to go to Kazakhstan, to the presidential archive there. And I was actually surprised by the wealth of material that was there and that was accessible. So now I was really lucky because the bulk of that field work, especially in Ukraine, happened before 2014. And from what I understand now, access to some of these archives, and especially the documents pertaining to security policy and anything nuclear, which always rings bells, has been more restricted. And indeed, when I went back in the summer of 2017, I had found that some of the previous documents I was able to access were withheld, were no longer available. So through a combination of luck and just trial and error and learning to navigate the archives, I was able to piece that story together. But as later on, when I was already a postdoc at managing data at Harvard and later at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies, I was able to supplement the story also from the American side. So from the Bush Senior, Bush 41st Presidential Library, from National Security Archives has a wealth of materials that hasn't even been, the surface hasn't been scratched on that. There's a lot of documents on CTR. So, if all I can say is encourage scholars to go and make good use of these documents.
Mariana, you and Matt Bunn just published an article very recently in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists discussing Russia's spurious allegations that Ukraine is developing a nuclear capability. Could you help our viewers and listeners understand why these Russian claims are, as you call them in the article, dangerous nonsense?
Yes, as Matt Bunn and I argue in the article that you mentioned, Hanna, and which should be very well known to the Russian powers that be, Ukraine actually is quite some ways from having access to the kinds of nuclear technologies and nuclear capabilities that are necessary to launch a fully fledged nuclear program. That was actually true back 30 years ago when Ukraine came into the possession became the inheritor of this nuclear capability and nuclear arms. So what Ukraine actually inherited back at the time was a chunk of a nuclear arsenal that was developed by a different country for the strategic purposes of that country. Some of these assets were more easily seizable, quote unquote, but others would have been quite difficult to refashion, for Ukraine's strategic purposes and strategic ends, for instance. This is not to say, Ukraine did at that time back then probably had a greater capacity than it does now. There is such thing as kind of knowledge atrophy and institutional forgetting as much as there is institutional learning. So there were scientists back at the time that had clearances in the Soviet nuclear program. There were institutions that collaborated with the Soviet, with the Soviet military-industrial complex. But in terms of a nuclear weapons program, Ukraine was a lot more generously endowed in terms of being able to manufacture delivery vehicles, such as missiles or even aircraft and bombers, than it was in terms of the nuclear fuel cycle. Ukraine had, and to this day, has uranium mining and milling. That's pretty much it, right? So that's for all of us who know a little something about what it takes to produce, to manufacture nuclear fuel. We understand that there needs to be a set of conversion facilities, then enrichment facilities, then fuel fabrication facilities. There need to be weapon labs that design warheads and know how to fit them onto a missile. So at that point, there were pieces of that in Ukraine. Of course, there were physical weapons themselves. It would have been risky, of course, to try and dismantle a Russian-made nuclear or a Soviet-made nuclear weapon and tried to kind of reverse engineer it or something like that. But that was there was a lot more material, as it were, to work with then that there is now, that Ukraine had for 30 years, cooperated with the IAEA and all of its facilities are under safeguards. There has been, as a result of nuclear security summitry, all of the highly enriched uranium, some 250 kilos between Kharkiv and Kiev, had been removed from Ukraine. So there isn't even that bit of fissile material that's left there. Ukraine has one research reactor in Kiev. In Kharkiv, as we have been keeping an eye on it recently with the Russian attacks, there's a subcritical assembly, which is not the kind of facility that can remotely produce the kind of fissile material necessary for a bomb. There are storages of spent fuel at Chernobyl, specifically spent fuel from the Chernobyl reactors, the RBMK reactors, that are relatively rich in plutonium, but you would need to build a plutonium separation facility. Again, something that you can't do under the bombs, or even in a peacetime without running afoul of the IAEA. So perhaps if in some kind of long-term perspective, long-term time scale, Ukraine, just like dozens and dozens of other countries, could find a way to launch such a program. Russian claims today have absolutely no basis. And the thing is, the Russians know it because they know very well the nuclear capacities and nuclear programs, of Ukraine. And all the more so that, these are the same people who have been for years saying, oh, Ukrainians knew nothing about nuclear things when they inherited these bombs back in the 90s, and it was like monkey with a grenade and all of that kind of derisive thing. So, clearly anyone who knows anything about nuclear weapons production could understand just how nonsensical Russian claims are.
Thanks for that, Mariana. Let's return to the book. The book looks at the circumstances under which Ukraine acceded to the NPT, which you already mentioned, and in that context, gave up the nuclear warheads on its territory to Russia. Now, what do you think are the implications of Russia's war against Ukraine, but also Russia's saber rattling that we've heard in recent weeks for the future of the non-proliferation regime, including the NPT? I mean, we do now have a review conference of the NPT finally scheduled for August of this year. What do you think are the implications here?
So Hanna, as you mentioned, as part of the deal to convince Ukraine to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, as a non-nuclear weapon state, the depository states of the NPT, the United States, Britain, and the Russian Federation, signed with Ukraine a so-called Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances to Ukraine. Now, this document is now being hotly debated, just as hotly debated as it was forgotten completely for some 20 or so years. The significance of the Budapest Memorandum back then was, it was part of the deal that Ukraine negotiated and got, and it was a fair deal in my estimate. But the very fact that Ukraine got a deal was a recognition in and of itself that these were Ukrainian weapons to give up. And that already was an achievement because, the Russian Federation said no. So the very fact that Ukraine did get this deal was in and of itself important to Ukraine as a way of recognition that these were Ukrainian weapons to give up. This was not a foregone conclusion. This was actually the crux of the debate, because the Russian Federation said, Ukraine has no claim to those. Those are nuclear weapons, and Ukraine just simply needs to transfer them to Russia, very much so like, US nuclear weapons in Turkey or in Belgium or elsewhere. But the crux of the negotiations on the Ukrainian part was to say, no, we are successors of the Soviet Union just as much as the Russian Federation is. It is true we don't want to hold on to these weapons, but we are entitled to a fair deal for giving them up. So in 1992, 93, 94, this was basically the whole subject of negotiations between Russia and the United States and Ukraine. Now, the negotiations of the security assurance part of this deal started already in June 1992, and Ukrainians, perceiving not unjustifiably in retrospect that this Russian Federation, this new Russia, might be a continuation of the old in more ways that Ukrainians cared to live next to. And the questions of Crimea, of Sevastopol, of the division of the Black Sea Fleet were already becoming very, very thorny issues. So Ukrainians felt, legitimately threatened and wanted to provide for their security somehow. And they demanded or requested security guarantees, quote unquote. That was something they in the end could not get, not from the United States, because in the US perception, a guarantee is something that's akin to the Article 5 commitment of NATO, for instance, and it involves a military pledge, right? A pledge to participate militarily somehow in the security of a state that is being guaranteed. And that is, understandably something the United States was not willing to promise or pledge to this new country, Ukraine, right? No matter how the Ukrainian diplomats tried. Ukrainians tried to say, all right, well, then maybe we could have this in a legally binding format as a treaty, for instance. But then, a treaty would have to go to Congress and receive the consent for ratification. And everyone who operates in Washington knows that if you can avoid going to Congress or to Senate to get approval for a treaty, you do it. And the U.S. could, or the administrations, first Bush and then Clinton, they could. They had a lot of leverage. And there was Ukraine, and there was these two large nuclear states. They had more leverage than Ukraine did in negotiations. So in the end, they agreed this Memorandum of Understanding, which was basically a political document. In terms of content, of substance of it, it really didn't pledge anything new to Ukraine. They were mostly clauses copy-pasted from other multilateral documents, such as the UN Charter, such as the OSCE Helsinki Final Act, and the negative and positive security assurances that NPT nuclear weapon states give to all non-nuclear states under the NPT. So that was sort of the content of it. The only new thing was the provision for a consultation mechanism. So parties should convene and consult in case there are issues with the memorandum. That mechanism was invoked on March 5th, 2014. There was a meeting of signatories. Of course, the Russian Federation did not attend it. There was a statement that came out, and then again, things kind of went quiet, and the memorandum as a document itself was sidelined for whatever reason. That's for future historians to look into the documents and establish. But both the breach of the memorandum by the Russian Federation and the further sidelining of this memorandum in the political discourse that followed, I believe, is extremely damaging to the non-proliferation regime, broadly speaking. Because, as we all know, international institutions are very difficult to build and then are very easy to damage. Right? NPT is an essentially discriminatory regime, and there are a set of bargains that are there to ameliorate this unequal treatment of equal sovereign states under the treaty, right? So 5 states are recognized nuclear weapon states, and the rest have to, forego any, plans to develop nuclear weapons. That's an unequal treatment. And, the understanding is that overall, that situation should be better for everybody somehow than not having a treaty. Well, I mean, for one, we've seen already a growing rift between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states within the regime, right? There's kind of this swelling, this kind of insurgency, based on the perception that nuclear weapon states are not holding up their part of the bargain. They're not fulfilling their obligations under Article 6 on arms control and disarmament. And the ban treaty is the outcome of that rift. And so now you have a situation where a major nuclear weapon state not only does not do enough to control nuclear arms, it is actually invading a non-nuclear weapon state that it had guaranteed to secure, in whatever terms. But the Budapest Memorandum is now part and parcel of the broader non-proliferation regime. It had accompanied, as it were, was an attachment to Ukraine's act of accession to the treaty. So whatever its form, whether it's legally binding or not, it is part now of the broader framework. And one has to wonder what kind of value a security assurance has anymore for future proliferation, non-proliferation, as a tool to reassure other potential proliferators. So I mean, it's hard to assess now the full scope of the fallout, but I grapple to find any positive outcomes out of both the breach and kind of the Western unwillingness to make much use, even either rhetorically or politically, out of this document.
Quite a pessimistic picture indeed, Mariana. Can I just follow up and ask, is your assessment equally pessimistic when it comes to the prospects for nuclear arms control? I mean, we've had a strategic stability dialogue between the United States and Russia that was commenced last summer that appeared to be going somewhere. Of course, that has now been suspended. How do you see the prospects for anything in the realm of strategic reductions, talking tactical nuclear weapons, let alone drawing other nuclear weapon states into arms control?
It is possible and likely that strategic arms control and a prospect of negotiating and signing the follow-on treaty to New START, for instance, is one of the casualties of this current war. Treaties take a long time to negotiate and sign. And we all know that this next treaty would have been even more difficult to negotiate and more difficult to verify, because the United States would have been keen to bring in the non-strategic nuclear weapons into the picture. And we were looking for ways, sustainable ways to verify nuclear warhead destruction, something that is extremely tricky and has never been done before. So, perhaps the silver lining in this whole story is that because Russia is kind of brandishing its nuclear might to deter Western involvement in the conflict. I think that's kind of superfluous anyways. There are very good reasons why the United States and NATO would not get involved, whether Mr. Putin impresses upon everyone how big a nuclear power he is. But I think a very real worry, the non-negligible chance and non-negligible concern that Russia might perhaps resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine as a demonstrative use, as a way to end the war that's not going according to Mr. Putin's plan, end it quickly and end it on Russian terms. Again, it's highly unlikely, but the chance is greater than zero now. We have to contemplate it as a possibility. A number of analysts have come out and weighed in on that. So that kind of scare, that kind of realization might actually spur, when the dust settles on this war, might spur the pressures and the public perhaps urge, to do something about arms control. There might be more pressures from the ground up now that this idea and this topic has become a lot more, pervasive, and there's a greater awareness of it publicly. I mean, we've been saying for a long time that, hey, publics don't really care. Publics care about economy. The publics, it's no longer like in the Cold War where people, did duck and cover when it was so top of mind. Well, this actually brings it back, to the very, very top of minds. And hopefully it might put pressure on the political leaders to then pursue, arms control in a more effective way. And it's also a big question to us, the analysts. We have spent so many decades and so many pieces of paper have been, trees have been felled to write the treatises about nuclear deterrence. But we have thought of how to deter nuclear war and nuclear exchange. We have not given enough thought of how to deter nuclear use against a non-nuclear weapons country. And right now, as it stands, there's actually nothing to deter it, nothing that I can see, other than maybe Ukrainian air defenses, which are suboptimal.
Mariana, this is so fascinating. And I think we're sort of getting into a conversation about some of our assumptions within the field of IR that underpin some of these policy recommendations that people are discussing as they think about, the resolution to this war and also what's going to happen next. You had what I thought was a really great and insightful thread on Twitter last week where you made this observation that the war in Ukraine should prompt some serious soul searching and reconsideration within the field of IR about some of these assumptions. I hoped you could kind of recap some of the points that you made in that thread and help us understand a little bit more about where, in your view, the last 16, 17, 18 days since February 24th should challenge some of those assumptions that we tend to hold in this field.
I mean, a Twitter thread is a Twitter thread, and it was written in a bit of an emotional way. But I think the main points that I was trying to make there is that we miss a lot if we just conceive of the world that's made up of these great powers. And this is not a new criticism of IR. There has been a lot of progress made to look at, the agency of other states. But I think, both for Moscow's planning and in the way perhaps things were looked from Washington as well, there was a great overestimation of what a responsible nuclear power would do, right? Someone like Russia, of what the rationale and the rational calculations might look like on their part, and underestimation of what the Ukrainian defenses could do. Right? We just a few years ago, when the Congress authorized the release of javelins, the first batch of these anti-tank weapons to Ukraine as it was defending itself in the eastern provinces in the Donbass, the Obama administration decided not to release these weapons because it thought they would be, escalatory, or perhaps because Ukrainian military was unable to learn to use them, or it was so corrupt that they would be sold on the black market. So there's, not to say that there isn't corruption, but there's these kind of preconceived ideas of what the small states or smaller states are capable of. And I think this is what's going on in Ukraine today, is a reevaluation of that approach. I mean, I've had people who dealt for decades with the former Soviet Union still to this day asking me, oh, is Ukrainian really a separate language, or is it a dialect of Russian? there's such limited competency in knowing these other cultural and political context, especially in the nuclear field, precisely because it has been focused on these nuclear powers, which also, happen to be the P5 and, and a collection of sort of auxiliary others like, Israel and Pakistan and India and North Korea that are sort of outside of the pale somewhere. So I think that's one set of questions that we have to really evaluate the agency in IR. And I dare say that much of the NATO expansion debate has also focused very much of like, oh, the West expanded NATO, as if it was merely the West's, the collective West or the Washington's decision to do so. And we don't pay enough attention to the Polands, to the Czech republics and the Hungaries of the world that actually, made a case for themselves, and the case that was legitimate, and the case that was heeded at the time for very good reasons. Again, I think they're feeling pretty good right now about being in NATO. So that's one part. Another part is exactly what we've been discussing about the non-proliferation regime and the assumptions that we made about the main bargains encoded in it, the bargains on which it had rested, and the quality of and the level of assurances that non-nuclear states can rely on for their security, right? To not be attacked, to not suffer existential threat. We're not talking about kind of encroachment on border regions even anymore. We're talking in Ukraine, the survival of the state as it has been for the last 30 years at the hands of a nuclear armed power that is not shy using nuclear threats to deter any greater assistance that Ukraine is already receiving. So we see this kind of the situation is stacked very unevenly, and we assume that there is a sort of a set of responsibilities that these great powers have, that no, they wouldn't, that no, and a lot of these assumptions are being undermined right now in a most tragic way. So I do think when we emerge from all of this, we'd have to reconsider the nuclear non-proliferation regime as it is conceived right now.
Thank you for that, Mariana. And with that, I want to come to our last question for today. So the main objective in Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower, this new videocast series, is to draw connections between cutting-edge new academic research and real-world challenges. So I want to ask you, where do you think the academic and research community can be most helpful at this time in contributing to policymaker and also public knowledge about this ongoing Russian war in Ukraine? And what strategies do you use to do this most effectively?
Thank you, Hanna. That's a really big question. And I think it is certainly, we're a collection of scholars and thinkers with very different foci, right, of our work. And I think every one of us can find something, to learn from this situation, whether, it is the conventional military operations and the escalation letters, or the way, nuclear signaling and nuclear threats work, or, the kind of underpinnings of the global nuclear order in which we live, and how sustainable it is, and it's going to be after this. I mean, I can imagine scholars looking at how to reform the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. I mean, we see it gridlocked, like in most really important cases, because one of the major countries and a veto wielding power is the actual culprit and is the aggressor. We will have to rethink our nuclear energy governance. And the way IAEA is capable to, to help ensure the security of nuclear power plants. We see Russian forces shelling and occupying civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine, which is, again, Russia has been part of the unanimous decision at the IAEA to recognize that use of military force, or threat of military force against a civilian nuclear facility constitutes the breach of UN Charter. So there's a lot of rethinking we have to do when a major stakeholder in the international system, in the global nuclear governance, basically goes rogue. And we find ourselves in a situation where there's very few firebreakers, where there's very few things we as an international community can do. And the most effective thing right now is basically arming Ukrainians. That's all there is. It boils down to a few 100,000 Ukrainian men and women standing up to the aggressor. And of course, the united Western response in terms of sanctions. I think the economists on that end will have a very interesting set of research questions and empirical data to see what it takes to extract the world's 11th largest economy from the world economy, and the fallout of that. I think the questions of energy and our dependence on oil and gas, especially from the countries that have sort of unsavory regimes, is going to come. Those chickens will come to roost, and something we've been discussing for a long time. But now we're in this real crux where Europe is highly dependent on Russia. So I really think this will be. This will shake up both the practice and the study of international relations in many important ways and many interesting ways.
Mariana, thank you so much for taking the time with us this morning. This has been such a fascinating conversation. We've loved getting the chance to hear about your work, your new book, its relationship with what we're seeing right now in the world. So thank you. To our viewers, thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
And thank you so much for talking to me.